I think I should start by offering you a Sierra Leonean greeting, more in the form of a question. How the body this morning? The body fine? Yeah? As I understand it, my remit is to do two things. First is to provide a little bit of context, historical context for some of the stuff that we'll be discussing today. And the second is to offer a kind of taster, so to raise some issues about politics and economics, which people will take up in greater detail in the other presentations. Now, perspectives on Africa, I think, have tended to lurch between bouts of very heady optimism and longer periods, perhaps, of acute pessimism. The first years after independence, of course, were marked by a considerable optimism about the ability of African states to deliver genuine improvements in the lives of their populations. By the mid-60s, as the one-party states kind of got settled in, and then as military coups followed one after the other, that turned to pessimism. There was then a brief revival of optimism with the ending of Portuguese rule, the so-called Second Independence, and then that was followed by the 80s and 90s, which was really grim. It was a really sort of negative, or at least the assessment of Africa's present and future at that time was extremely negative. And the mood was captured in the famous edition of The Economist in 2000, which took Sierra Leone as being essentially the symbol for the continent of Africa as a whole. And the front page splashed it as Africa, the hopeless continent. All of this has suddenly changed. It's 15 years down the road, and suddenly, without so much as batting an eyelid, The Economist is telling us exactly the opposite, that somehow Africa is this wonderful success story. Celebrations are in order, without telling us how we've got necessarily from one to the other. So we're now back to a period where people are being extremely optimistic about Africa's future. Now, the problem with this lurching between the heady optimism and the acute pessimism is that actually the truth tends to lie somewhere in the middle, at least in my view. In the first decade of independence, despite the political problems, at least before the OPEC oil crisis of 1973, most African countries actually experienced reasonable levels of economic growth. Let's go back one. Reasonable levels of economic growth and improvements in the living standards of their populations. So life expectancy went up, the number of children in school went up. By most social indicators, actually things got better. And at the present time, despite the very optimistic assessments, I think there are also grounds for being cautious, not to get overly excited and to see things in a little bit more of a historical context. The claims that Africa is being propelled along one trajectory or another, I think needs to be seen in some kind of a context, because things aren't necessarily moving uniformly in any one direction, whether that is political or economic. So as I've said, in the first 15 years of independence, you have economic growth, which is relatively steady, but you have at the same time the collapse of democracy at that particular moment. 1994, in more recent times, a classic year in a sense. Here we have the ending of apartheid, a period of heady optimism in South Africa, alongside the Rwandan genocide. So two remarkable sets of events happening simultaneously. At the present time, we have countries which have gone through periods of difficulties of various kinds, which have followed kind of parallel trajectories and then started to, as it were, move off in different directions. Ghana and Uganda in the 1970s really went through the mill, Uganda more than Ghana perhaps, but really went through the mill, went through this renaissance through the 90s and into the 2000s perhaps, and have started to diverge again. Ghana, I think, I shouldn't say this, it's tempting fate, but I think later this year Ghana will almost certainly have another election which will go go fine and may well produce yet another change of government. In the case of Uganda, clearly democratization in Uganda has stalled. So Ghana and Uganda are once again moving off, it seems, in somewhat different directions. Rwanda and Burundi, these kind of siblings which share much in common, often converge and then seem to go off in different directions as well. Now, I think what I'm not trying to say is that it's all very complicated and we can't make any generalizations. On the opposite, I think we can make generalizations, but we have to be careful that the generalizations that we make are based on evidence and based on some understanding of the differences as well as the similarities. There are 50 different countries in Africa, or more than 50 different countries, very different shapes and sizes and demographic profiles, very different histories, different potentialities and constraints. The landlocked states of West Africa in the Sahel have their own particular problems and histories, and they're not very similar to the littoral states of East Africa, and they're not even very similar to the landlocked states of the Great Lakes. So again, we have to understand the variations. And what we need to do, at least those of us who study Africa for a living, is to look at the clustering, how certain clusters of phenomena are established. Now, what I want to do now is to start by looking a little bit at the deeper historical record, because I think too often discussions about contemporary Africa are ahistorical. There's a popular myth out there, particularly in the former colonizing countries, such as Britain and France and Belgium, that African leaders at the point of independence squandered, you might say, their colonial inheritance. But this is something that really needs to be looked at, I think, more closely. Before the Second World War, most colonial states were not in the business of what we would call delivering public goods, by which I mean things like health and education. They didn't collect very much in the form of tax because the import-export firms didn't want to pay export duties, mining companies didn't want to pay royalties, there was a limit to how much you could extract from people in the form of direct taxation, so there wasn't that much money there in the pot, and what was there was spent very sparingly and tended to be spent in the capital cities. And it was only after the Second World War that this commitment was made to what we now call development. The word development is a post-war invention, and the British and the French in particular made very grand promises about how they were going to open up Africa through large infrastructural investments, that they were going to deliver on education, they were going to deliver on health, and they were going to make these public goods available not just in the capital city, but in the most remote rural village. Great. The question then was, who was going to pay for it? Well, originally, there was a commitment that there would be a transfer of resources from the metropole, so-called, to the colonies, and France put its money where its mouth was for several years. But then the penny dropped. If all Africans in the French colonies became French citizens, this entitled them to what any other French person could demand. And then the issue was, who was going to pay for it? In Britain, it was a similar story. People started to get a little bit nervous in London when Gambians and Nigerians started to demand, a considerable injection of resources to improve the access to public goods that were there. So in either case, what happened is that colonial states got cold feet and started to look to exit strategies. Now, in the British case, I suppose actually with Algeria and the French case as well, there was a complication that white settler minorities thought that they had a veto, but otherwise, once Ghana had become independent in 1957, that was it, in a sense. The metropolitan governments were then looking for ways to get out, and in the case of the Gambia, more or less had to push the Gambia into independence. So you have this kind of interesting meeting of minds. Nationalist leaders liked to argue that they had slayed the colonial dragon, that they had forced out the British or the French. And the British and the French like to say, well, we left willingly, we pulled the flag down. France, of course, had its problems, but mostly in sub-Saharan Africa went peacefully. But of course, on both sides of this story, it was a little bit more complicated than that. It was in the interests of the colonial powers to withdraw. So this is all happening at a time of high commodity prices. So it's just the ideal moment to decolonize is roughly through the 1950s into the early 60s. After that, I have a slide here somewhere, but probably not the next one. We'll leave that for the moment. at a time of high commodity prices, it was easy to decolonize, relatively easy. Once independent states took over, they suddenly realized that the promises that had been made were actually going to be rather difficult to deliver on. Where was the money going to come from to pay for a massive expansion of, say, education in Senegal? You can try to raise taxes, you can try to get foreign companies to pay more in the form of royalties and so on. In many cases, what had to happen is the countries started to look for aid in order to, in a sense, balance the books. Now, when economies stalled in the mid-70s, one of the diagnoses, which later came to inform structural adjustment policies, was that poor policy choices was what led to failure. And this was famously argued by Robert Bates in a book called Markets and States in Tropical Africa. And the argument was a very simple one, which was that governments were beholden to urban interest groups and therefore tended to tax agriculture, smallholder agriculture, in order to basically pay for the amenities enjoyed by urbanites. Now, at one level, yeah, there's an element of truth to this. The Cocoa Marketing Board in Ghana, for example, did tax cocoa farmers pretty heavily. But it's rather ahistorical because, as I've already indicated, governments needed to find the revenues to pay for what they regarded as their commitments under the development. In a sense, they were trying to deliver on the social contracts that had been made around about the time of independence. And what was working against them, of course, was a rapidly rising population which was very young and which typically placed greater demands on the state. So we have to understand why governments made the choices that they did. And in many cases, revisionist opinion is along the lines of saying, well, okay, maybe setting up 100 parastatals in the space of 6 months is not such a great idea. But was Nkrumah wrong when he talked about Ghana's need for an industrial strategy, the need for investments in infrastructure, the importance of the Volta Dam? I think if you look at those almost obsessions on the part of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, I think he basically was right. The execution could have been rather a lot better, but the central ideas, I think, were often borne out in the long run. So that's a little bit of history. Now, if we look at what's going on in more recent times, I think we have to distinguish elements that are essentially stable and elements that represent structural transformations and which are potentially, at least, game changers for the future. Now, democratization. This is one where during the 1990s, everyone was very excited about what was happening in Africa because for the first time you had the change of government through the ballot box and some of the most well-entrenched dictatorships, like the one in Benin, were voted out. But then it all sort of got a little bit stuck, and this particular slide gives you a sense of that. So if you look at the red line for autocracies, this is the African Development Bank's definitions, you see that in the 90s it starts to sort of tail off, but then it's not as dramatic as you might expect. And I think a table like that doesn't tell you the full story, because if we look at where the great turning points were, they were mostly in a relatively few numbers of countries. So changes of government through the ballot box in Cape Verde, Senegal, Ghana, Zambia. I've missed one or two. But in a number of countries where you might have thought that this was going to follow through, in fact, it didn't. And governments, or politicians, I would say, are very clever. They learn very quickly. And one of the things they learned is actually, if you are the great dictator, potentially, what's the best way of entrenching yourself in power? In the old days, it was to simply create a one-party state. Well, now it's to have an election, because what you do is you create a thoroughly uneven playing field. You then offer just enough of a glimpse to the opposition to make it worth them playing the game, so they stand for election, but everybody knows what the result is going to be, and it is then legitimized to some extent by the presence of foreign election observers, and then you go back to the presidential palace rubbing your hands with glee, because in a sense you've now been legitimated. So politicians have learnt that game, and I guess the election we saw in Uganda is a very good illustration of that. Military coups in Africa, I think, is perhaps a more interesting one, because the incidence of coups in Africa has declined. I think So in the mid-60s, as I've said, there was a lot of coups through the 70s. In more recent times, the incidence of coups has gone down. And one of the reasons why it's gone down is that it's not cool anymore. The African Union now has a very strict policy on military coups, that if you stage a military coup, you will be suspended from the AU and potentially sanctions will then follow. And this has led to some remarkable results. Nigeria, which for decades was under military dictatorships of one kind or the other, it was kind of past the parcel, it went from one to the next. A coup in Nigeria is now virtually unthinkable. That is an incredible transformation. A coup in Ghana is, again, touch wood, but is unthinkable. So something pretty dramatic has happened there. There is, however, there are some countries where, like in Guinea and Burkina Faso, where maybe they're bucking the trend, but I think this is something, more important structural transformation perhaps than the holding of elections. Now, if we turn to the economy, I think one of the depressing sides of this story is that Africa's economic development has always been heavily dependent upon primary commodity exports, for which global market prices are very uncertain. Zambia, for example, you can plot Zambia's ups and downs over the decades just by looking at the copper price. If the copper price is high, everybody breathes a sigh of relief. If it falls, and copper is not the greatest commodity to be in, then you're in a certain amount of trouble. Oil, of course, it's a similar story for Nigeria, Gabon, and other countries as well. Now we're in a situation where oil is being discovered in many new countries. Let's leave that one for a moment. The new kids on the block. So oil is popping up all over the place, and governments are getting very excited about the prospect of oil revenues coming in. The last decade has seen high commodity prices, which have correlated with high levels of economic growth. And these two things clearly are related. And much of the high commodity prices is related to China's engagement with Africa, especially with, well, many minerals and oil. Now, as China enters the doldrums, there is potentially, of course, a problem. The oil price has already, and several other commodities were wobbling, but many of Africa's most important commodities have seen quite significant falls in the price over the last few years. And if China's cold, which it recently contracted, turns into be something much more serious, then of course the knock-on effects on Africa are going to be very considerable. And you don't have to be an Afro-pessimist to predict that the very high levels of economic growth that you've seen in the last decade might start to tail off. So this is a cautionary tale, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so those are, in a sense, the constants. What are the structural transformations? Well, Ophelia has already referred to some of these yesterday, so I can perhaps go through this rather more quickly. The first game changer is urbanization. Up until the relatively recent past, Africa was a predominantly rural continent. Not so today. I think there are a number of countries where the urban population is now at 50% or above. Nigeria, it's just below 50, but growing. Ghana is now, when I first started studying Ghana, it was 2/3 to 1/3 rural to urban. Now in Ghana, it's the urban population which is the majority. So that is a pretty remarkable transformation. It's uneven. So in East Africa, you have relatively low rates of urbanization. Uganda is a good example of that. But the countries where urban populations are smaller, so those where urbanization is proceeding most rapidly, so they're catching up very fast. A country like Ethiopia, a country like Malawi, the rates of urbanization are pretty fast. So there's something pretty dramatic going on here in terms of where population is located. And certain consequences follow on from that. I've mentioned politics. In most African countries, the presidents are highly unpopular in the capital cities. In the capital cities, people tend to vote against the president after one election. They turn around and vote the other way. If you have a situation which much of the continent now has most of its people living in the cities, this has political consequences. Politics cannot proceed in the old way. The other point is that the World Bank, I should say, has got very excited about urbanization. It used to think urbanization was a very bad idea for Africa. Now it thinks it's a wonderful idea, and Africa's not urbanized enough. But one of the points they make is about agglomeration economies that emerge through having large conurbations. And Lagos is a very good example of this. What the population of Lagos actually is, nobody quite knows, but it's a lot and getting bigger all the time. And Lagos, for all its problems, is a good example of an agglomeration economy because of in particular, the rise of the, what would you call it? The cultural industries, you might say, the creative industries. Nollywood, Nigerian film, has been one of the continent's great successes, which has now been exported to other parts of Africa. That arises out of having a concentration of population around Lagos and other large urban centers. And it's spilling across borders. Let's leave that one. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. It's spilling across borders so that you now more or less have a continuous belt of urbanization running from Lagos in Nigeria through Benin, Togo into Ghana, and the potential effects of that are quite profound. Alongside that, we have the middle class. The African Development Bank has claimed that Africa's middle class now represents 34% of the population, that it's grown faster than it has in China and India, and that this is going to lead to all kinds of important consequences. What the middle class is, of course, is rather problematic. It's defined in this case in terms of consumption, not in terms of production. And it starts at $2 a day, which I would have thought is maybe slightly questionable. And if you chop out the people who are earning between $2 and $10 a day, your middle class suddenly starts shrinking by quite large proportions. But that said, there are countries in Africa where it's quite tangible. Much of Africa's economic growth in recent years has been driven by consumption, and it's often driven by consumption amongst those who the African Development Bank would call middle class. Not all of that is good. In Angola, the Angola middle class is consuming like crazy, but it's not consuming anything produced in Angola. I promised yesterday over dinner I would mention wine in South Africa. Wine is perhaps an interesting story because black South Africans have never drunk wine in South Africa. It's always been a major problem for the industry. Something is changing. Wealthy black South Africans are getting into wine in a big way. So there are, in some cases, examples where you can show that the emergence of middle class has its effects economically speaking. Whether the middle class is going to be any different in terms of its political behavior, I think the jury is still out on that. Ophelia yesterday mentioned Africa's youth. I think this is obviously a huge story. In Europe, and I guess in the United States probably as well, you have an aging population. Everybody's terrified about who's going to carry the burden of pensions. China has got a major headache of its own because of its one-child policy. China's economic development is essentially unsustainable because of that. Here we have a continent in Africa where you have a very young population and rising all the time. That is potentially a game changer. It's potentially extremely important economically and otherwise. But it depends, of course, on what you do with it. There's no point in having a large young population unless it's actually working, of course, and unless it's educated. And this is where the issue of the state, I think, is of paramount importance, because without states that can deliver public goods, you're not going to have a young population that is actually economically productive. I'm rapidly running out of time, but I did want to mention a couple of other things. The first is regional integration and continental integration. At the point of independence, most African leaders were nationalists. They wanted to industrialize behind tariff barriers. Now they've pretty much all been converted to the idea of regional integration and within that continental integration. So regional integration with the various economic communities and continental integration through the African Union. And some pretty fundamental things are happening. I'm following this myself in West and East Africa, but the harmonization of customs and immigration, these are really fundamental changes. And I think we can expect over the next decade that this is going to start to have some pretty profound effects. However, there are winners and there are losers. A country like Nigeria, in a sense, as we were discussing a moment ago, is potentially a loser because better insertion into the global economy has, up till now, meant greater insertion of Chinese goods into African markets at the expense of the Nigerian textile sector, at the expense of much of Nigerian manufacturing. So it's not, as with all these other things, it's not necessarily a positive. It depends on what you do with it. But clearly, regional integration is going to be important. Secessionism, I'm afraid to say, is back on the agenda. At the point of independence, there were secessionist rumblings, and the map of Africa was talked about, but then it pretty much went away, and everyone said, well, yeah, but, you know, Biafra was probably the turning point. Since Biafra never succeeded in seceding, that's the end of it. But it's not. The breakaway of Eritrea from Ethiopia maybe did not set a precedent quite. The breakaway of South Sudan from Sudan certainly has created a precedent, and secessionist movements are popping up all over the place. In fact, they even have their own organization, the Organization of Emerging African States, where they swap notes. And Biafran secession is back on the cards, and this has the potential to create major problems because, as things stand, nobody has a clear policy on the right of secession. It's basically an empirical thing. If you can keep a war going for long enough, then you might secede, but that's not a strategy. And for all the economic successes that Africa might chalk up, the one thing that could wreck everything is actually political violence. And although Africa has had considerable success in recent times in reducing its numbers of civil wars, this is not necessarily fixed in stone. And add to that the rise of Islamism in the Sahel and in East Africa, and potentially you have quite a cocktail, quite an explosive cocktail. So there are important things happening on the continent which nobody has yet really got their heads around. So, finally, in short, while the last 10 years has been pretty good to Africa, and some gains have certainly been consolidated, significant challenges, I think, do remain. And although it's good and refreshing to accentuate the positive, we also need to keep our critical wits about us and to be aware of the fact that things often change very, very rapidly. So on that note, I think I should stop. Thank you.